Morning, everyone. My name's Deb Fuster. For those I haven't met before, I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Victorian Council of Social Service, VCOSS, and it's lovely to be with you this morning for another edition of our Renters Rights Rundown series. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm meeting on. Today, I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay respects to elders and ancestors, and also to any First Nations colleagues who are on the call today. So we're here today for, as I said, another edition of our Renters' Rights Rundown series for 2025. And as you know, because you've signed up to this event, these events are for you, for frontline community sector workers, also people working in policy in the renting space, to learn more about or refresh your memory on Victoria's renting laws, which are set out in the Residential Tenancies Act 1997. It's been a lot of change to that legislation over the last few years, and it's really important that we make the most of the kind of new provisions available to the people that we support. So that's why we run these events, to make sure that we're across all the opportunities, aware of the gaps, and have the opportunity to kind of ask questions about particular dimensions of those new renting laws. So today we're focusing on climate change and renting, and we know that climate change is impacting us all, but we also know, as we work for people working in the community sector, that unfortunately it hits first and worst for people who are already experiencing other forms of disadvantage, including low-income renters who are living in poor quality rental homes, and also renters who are living in parts of the state that are at heightened risk of climate-driven disasters such as floods and fires. So in today's session, we're going to be looking at the impacts of climate risk on renters and the rental market, and look at the unique challenges that renters come up across in knowing, exercising, and enforcing their rental rights. That's really important for you as community sector workers, because we know that you have deep reach into communities, you have strong relationships of trust with renters, and so by equipping you with this information, we know that you're able to help the people that you support to know and understand and assert their rights. We're going to do a deep dive into these issues, and what we're going to look at covering a few different areas. Firstly, we're going to, as I said, delve into the unique challenges that renters face in the context of climate risk. Secondly, we're going to look at some of the key provisions under the RTA, the Residential Tenancies Act, and how renters can exercise these rights. And thirdly, we're going to have a look at how the RTA applies in practice, and we'll talk through a few case study examples that really illustrate the strengths and also the limitations of the Act in safeguarding climate-related renters' rights. No matter what part of the community services sector or system that you work in, if you're engaging with a person and they're a renter, as I said, we want to make sure that you've got the information that you need to be able to provide people with information about what their rights are, support them to assert their rights, and also just know about and be able to refer them to specialised supports where that extra support, that tailored assistance might be needed. So to cover all this content today, we've got three special guests with us. I'll mention who they are, and then I'll introduce them each to do a short presentation. Firstly, we have Julianne Tice, a fantastic colleague of mine at VCOSS. Julianne is VCOSS's climate policy advisor, an absolute wealth of knowledge, and Julianne is going to help us with some scene setting. She's going to take us through a statewide picture of climate risk and adaptation, which I think is really important grounding for the conversation today. Secondly, we're very lucky to have Kellie Davis with us. Kellie is the disaster recovery lead at Financial Counselling Victoria. Very, very important peak body in this ecosystem. And Kellie will discuss the impact of climate risk on renters and the rental market, and talk us through the unique challenges that renters face in the context of climate risk. And finally, Kellie will be joined or followed by Tim Koerner, the Climate and Disaster Justice Lead at Tenants Victoria, a very long-standing friend of VCOSS, is Tim, in various roles that he's had over the years, and of course Tenants Victoria, very, very close colleague and member organisation of VCOSS. So great to have not only Tenants Victoria involved, but to have our friend Tim as well, presenting and sharing his expertise. Tim's going to provide us with a legal full deep dive into the key rights that renters may face, the key rights that renters have under the RTA and the barriers renters may face in exercising their rights. And importantly, we always want to be in the space of being kind of solutions focused. So while we're going to be kind of like talking about a lot of the challenges today, what this really is about is like looking for like where those solutions are. So what the kind of leverage points are in our legislation, in our regulatory system, in the support services space as well. Once these presentations have concluded, we'll then have time for a Q&A session, and I'll provide some closing remarks right at the end. I do want to signal that we'll do the kind of the question and answers at the end, but I know that you'll have questions as you're hearing presenters in real time. So just really encourage you to start kind of feeding those questions into the not the chat, but the Q&A box that we've got kind of like set up, Q&A field here for these questions. We might not be able to get to all questions. If we can't, we will take some of those on notice and come back to you as a follow-up, but start putting your questions in as we kind of go along. So we're going to get stuck in, and it's my pleasure to welcome Julianne from VCOSS. I'm going to switch my camera off now and hand over to my colleague Julianne. Thanks, Julianne.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Deb. What I will do is just share my screen. If you just give me 1 minute, hopefully this will work. Oh, I've got to allow Zoom to share my screen, which I don't think I can do. Maybe, Amy, if you are able to share those, if that's a possibility. I will just hang tight for a second. Maybe I'll get speaking, and then maybe if the slides pop up while I'm speaking, that would be ideal. Otherwise, I'll just speak. So thanks so much, Deb. Would also just like to acknowledge that I'm dialing in from Wonderland today, and would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Acknowledge that we're all dialing in from stolen lands today. So I will be giving a bit of a statewide perspective on climate change and renting before we hear from our other excellent speakers for a little bit more of a deep dive into the topic. So I wanted to talk about climate adaptation specifically and renters. And the reason I want to talk about adaptation as opposed to disaster resilience is because VCOSS recently ran a renters' rights rundown event on disaster recovery and renting, which was a really excellent event. Really encourage you to check that out if you haven't seen it yet. But we do want to differentiate a little bit between those acute climate impacts like flood, bushfire, extreme heat days, and storms, and the longer term impacts of climate change, like increasing temperatures, increasing dryness, less rainfall overall, those things leading to drought, because we actually have kind of different experiences of those acute climate impacts that are those disaster impacts versus those long-term everyday impacts. And often when people think about climate change, they think about those disasters, those acute impacts, and we think a little bit less about those long-term everyday impacts. So we really want to draw attention to those through this session today. And what those long-term impacts of climate change mean for renters is quite a myriad of impacts. We've got physical and mental health impacts, which really flow through to all parts of life, increasing costs for lots of things in life, especially things like home insurance. So if insurance for a home increases, that a landlord may pass that on to the tenant. And I believe our other speakers will speak to that in a bit more detail. Increasing costs for fuel and groceries, which of course impacts other parts of renters' lives. Other impacts include damage to homes and displacement and connection to place, especially from disaster. And it is kind of impossible to untangle or disentangle disaster resilience from adaptation. They're very much interconnected, but I think there is value in separating out the two a little bit. I did have an image that I wanted to share, which, oh, it looks like my slides are coming up, which is fantastic. Thank you so much, Amy. I'll just pause there. And I'll just go to, I think it's the 4th slide that has an image of Greater Melbourne on it, 2 side by side. Amazing. Thank you so much, Amy. So here we've got a view of Greater Melbourne. We've got rates of poverty on the left and heat on the right. And this is a really great demonstration of the fact that the impacts of climate change aren't equal. Generally, what we see is that the impacts of climate change are felt first and worst by people who are experiencing poverty, disadvantage, marginalization. And this image really encapsulates that really well. It's Greater Melbourne LGAs, not a statewide view. We haven't done that statewide mapping yet, but this is a piece that VCOSS put out a couple of years ago to really demonstrate that what this is showing is if you are living in an area with a higher rate of disadvantage, which is those LGAs in darker shades of blue on the left, you're more likely to also be living in an area with a higher, with more heat, essentially. So we've got urban heat index on the right, and those darker shades of orange and red are higher rates of heat. So a big part of that is to do with lack of open green space and tree cover in especially Melbourne's west and southeastern suburbs, but also very much tied in with this is housing quality. So we know that rental houses tend to be lower quality in terms of especially those things that seem a little bit dry, like insulation, draft ceiling, efficient air conditioning, and other appliances. But those are the things that really make a home a safe place, especially when it's hot. And of course, that also relates to other climate impacts as well, like storms and things like that. But I guess the point here is that the impacts of climate change are felt differently, and renters are put at a disadvantage, often because of where they live and the quality of housing that they live in. We'll go to the next slide. Also just wanted to provide a very brief outlook of the summer and what we can expect from the summer coming up. On the screen here, we've got a statewide view of Victoria. This is not a projection, it's actually historic days, hot days over certain temperatures that you see on screen. This is taken from the Victorian Climate Science Report 2024, and that's a great source of information on what we will expect from climate change in Victoria, and I'll link to that in the chat when I'm finished presenting. So what we can see on that map is two periods, 1986 to 2005 in the green dots, and 2003 to 2022 in the blue dots. And that shows that there's been an increase in very hot days all across Victoria. But it's also useful, I think, just to see where those hot days are really being felt. And that's areas like the northeast of the state, the northwest of the state, that are particularly heating up. And so what we're going to see from this summer is kind of conditions that Victoria is projected to see overall as a result of climate change. And that's warmer and drier conditions, less rainfall overall, but rainfall that's concentrated into smaller periods of time. And all of that leads to more heat, more likelihood of bushfire, and more likelihood of flood. And what the implications of that for renters maybe, and for your organization is increasing need for support from your organizations, but also increasing costs for food because of agricultural impacts, increasing costs for insurance due to increasing frequency and severity of disaster, increasing fuel costs, and increasing damage to homes. And so all of that means renters are likely to need more support this summer and moving forward. And then we'll just go to the last slide. Thank you, Amy. So I've just got some resources here on screen. If this is a topic you're interested in, here's some areas you can go to for more information. VCOSS does run a climate network for community organizations. So if you're interested in finding out more about that, really encourage you to send me an email. My emails are on screen. I'll also send something in the chat after this. VCOSS's Adaptation for All report was released a couple of months ago. That went into a lot of these issues in much more detail than I've been able to go into today. But if you're interested in the intersections between future climate impacts, how people are adapting, impacts to renters and different cohorts, really encourage you to check that out as well. I'll also send a link to that. And there's some other areas you can go to for information and advice around all of this. I've listed them in ease of access, so I can send a few of those links in the chat as well. And I will wrap up there. Thank you so much. I'll pass back over to Deb.
Thank you so much, Julianne. Really fantastic, informative presentation, and a great way to kind of ground the rest of the conversation this morning. Very grateful for your time. So it's now my pleasure to welcome Kellie, Financial Counselling Victoria's Disaster Recovery Lead. Thanks so much, Kellie. Over to you.
Good morning. Thank you, Deb. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to join today. I'm just going to start screen sharing. Bear with me. Are you seeing the right screen there? Are you seeing a correct view there, Deb?
Looks great. Thank you, Kellie.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm not seeing the right view. I'm so sorry. Just go back a few. First of all, I just also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands upon which we meet. For me, that's also the Wurundjeri people. Acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and this always will be Aboriginal land. I am sorry, I'm having big issues with my screen sharing here, so I apologise, I'm jumping all over the place. I am the Disaster Recovery Lead at Financial Counselling Victoria. I'm also a qualified financial counsellor, having previously worked in bushfire and flood response. So first of all, a little bit of an overview about what financial counselling is for those of you who may not be aware. Financial counselling is a free, confidential and independent service. Financial counsellors work with people in financial hardship. So we work to understand their situation from both a financial and their life perspective, because that intertwines. And we work through the client's options, help them through their decision-making process, and then support them trying to achieve their outcomes. That may mean they self-advocate. It may mean that they actually require us to advocate with creditors and third parties on their behalf. Big focus on insurance for me today. So insurance is a financial product, and advocating with insurers is something we do. Okay, I can't see my notes, so I'm going to wing this a little bit. Please bear with me. You will see this on screen. This is from a study done after the 2019-2020 bushfires, that renters are quite vulnerable to disasters, and they're often in lower quality housing, earn less money and lack insurance. That's really significant, the earning less money, lacking insurance and lower quality housing, because that adds to increased cost, increased vulnerability and increased risk for renters. Let's take a little bit of a dive into into rental affordability issues and pressures that financial counsellors see. So we know from studies that affordable rentals, are often in high risk areas as far as climate risk is concerned. That may be things like high risk flood areas on the urban fringes where there's some susceptibility to bushfire, storms and heat waves. Julianne mentioned earlier about lack of trees that adds significant up to 4 degrees onto the heat of an area. So where you're living in a house that may not be climate resilient, may not have proper insulation and adequate heating and cooling, you're more vulnerable to the cost that incurs upon a household. You're also more vulnerable to climate events. So a specific event, and we're not going to dwell on disasters too much, but a specific event like a flood or a bushfire often reduces the housing supply in that area for renters, and the rental in safer areas increases. So that might not be an affordable option for them. So short term, we see that the rental pool is reduced and the rent spikes in that what was previously an affordable area. And this can lead to a lot of consequences for renters, including displacement, moving out of the area. And longer term issues, we also see that landlords don't always build back in these high risk areas. That may be because they lacked insurance or because their insurance costs have spiked due to climate risk. And that reduces the rental pool for renters, an affordable rental pool. I'll keep stressing an affordable rental pool. So that presents many challenges, particularly in regional areas for people. Renters have very limited control over property resilience. They often cannot afford to make changes to the property that make it more climate resistant, or they're not allowed to do that by the landlord. And it doesn't make sense for a renter to invest in the landlord's property if they're there short term for things like insulation, higher energy rated appliances. Simple things like curtains can make a big difference for people. So it leaves renters more exposed to the financial cost of being in an unsuitable house, and it leaves them exposed to weather events. And when we think about weather events and their exposure, let's think about things like extreme heat and extreme cold, where you might run a heater or an air conditioner, and the cost of doing so can become unaffordable for renters, or can actually mean that they have a very high energy bill and that they're not then able to afford the repayments on that energy bill. So it's really, really important that renters are in suitable housing that is climate resilient, but we don't see that in the affordable space. It's not beneficial to builders. It's a cost to build climate resilient housing. It's not beneficial to builders in the high density urban sprawl areas that we see. Insurance is a huge factor here as well. So we do see that contents insurance is there's a very low uptake of that by renters. That's because the cost is increasing and ever increasing, and in high risk areas that may be unaffordable for renters, particularly renters on a low income, or it may not be available to them at all for that high risk event. Contents insurance can provide temporary accommodation cover, meaning if renters are in a house that is made suddenly uninhabitable, they may be covered by the insurer that will provide housing for them, an alternative rental for them for 6 to 12 months. So if they're not taking the contents insurance, they're not getting that financial protection of assured housing and safe and secure housing due to a climate event. Displacement also leads to loss of employment in many cases. That may be due to there being nowhere in that area that they can obtain an affordable rent. And this is particularly common in regional areas where we see casual workers on farms and that are displaced due to a climate event, being unable to get back into that area within a distance from which they can travel to work, or that the cost of travelling to work because of increased fuel is so high, it's not sustainable for them to remain there. We're also seeing disaster risk mapping being done across the country, and that may lead to higher insurance premiums for the landlord. If that's the case, the landlord increases rent to cover that. That's a particular risk that we're concerned about at the moment, and that's starting to play out in the Shepparton area where their flood risk is quite high. So where insurance is still available to some people, it has gone up more than triple, and that cost is being passed on to renters, and that's an unaffordable cost. Financial hardship, that's where financial counsellors work, and speaking from feedback from financial counsellors, we're seeing some really common issues. And financial counsellors are often a good temperature gauge of what's happening in society. We start to see the problems come through first. So first of all, an overwhelming issue is that renters don't raise issues with their landlords. So where they're living in substandard housing that may not be climate resilient, they won't raise those issues and they won't request upgrades or repairs because of the risk of eviction. That's a real fear for renters. So they live in substandard housing and that can have an impact upon their health. After a climate event, a very low proportion of renters engage with financial counselling. They're usually not eligible for government grants. They don't have that insurance safety net, and they're not aware that we may be able to assist in other ways. So we can assist by looking at their income and expenses and seeing what we can do to support them or what other concessions may be available to them. But unfortunately, they don't engage, making that presumption that there won't be anything that can be done for them, or maybe they're not aware of the service. We've spoken about the high cost of insurance and renters not being able to afford insurance, so that they just don't have a financial safety net by which they can recover. And it's very difficult in a cost of living crisis anyway. It's very difficult to manage money when rental and energy costs are so disproportionately high. So you're paying really high cost to live in substandard, non-resilient housing. We're very aware, studies have shown, and we hear it from people all the time, that financial hardship and unsuitable, unaffording housing impacts on people's overall health and well-being. Where those financial stresses remain unaddressed, their mental health and well-being either declines or continues to be very poor. This can lead to long-term health issues and a lack of enjoyment of life. And we all have that basic right to quality housing and quiet enjoyment. Approximately 6 years ago, when I started as a financial counsellor, it was considered that 30% of income going to housing was the limit before it put someone into rental stress. That's the same for mortgage stress. So let's say housing stress. So 30% of your income being paid towards your rent, up to that mark, it was considered to be comfortable. recent ABS data and also what we're seeing from clients presenting for service, their cost of renting is 40 to 50% of their income. So imagine losing 50% of your income just to put a roof over your head and then still trying to pay possibly high energy bills, food, petrol, just meeting your daily living essentials. It's basically impossible. So we are seeing a growing proportion of renters in unsuitable housing, unable to get unable to get property in an area where housing might be more suitable for them. So they're living in this very, very vicious cycle of paying high rent, high utility bills and living in unsuitable housing in spite of that. Renters are the real hidden casualty of climate risk. They're not considered by government policy making, they're not considered by responses to climate events. Landlords don't give them special consideration based on their circumstances, and they are increasingly forced to be able to afford a rent. They're increasingly forced into high risk areas that is unsuitable housing and drives up their own cost of living. So I'd really urge you all to think about, that cost of living pressure. Added to that, where you're paying a climate risk tax on living in a rental property, life is pretty tough for renters out there. Thank you very much. I'll hand back
Thank you.
to Deb.
Thank you
Deb.
so much, Kellie. Thanks for that great presentation, and apologies. I know it's very difficult presenting in this online environment, so thanks for persisting with those kind of tech challenges at the outset. We'll now move on to Tim from Tenants Victoria. So welcome, Tim. Going to be talking about what kind of protections are available under the RTA. So thank you so much, Tim. Over to you.
Thanks, Deb, and hi, everybody. I'll see if I can share my screen and hopefully I have a bit better luck. Okay, how's that?
That's looking great, Tim. It's Deb speaking. That looks fantastic. So hopefully it's good at your end as well. Thank you.
Okay, terrific. Ooh, not really. It seems to be okay. Yeah, I'm sort of having difficulty seeing the whole of my notes. What I'll have to do is sort of go through and change the slides and refer to a paper version of my notes.
Thank you, Tim. It's Deb speaking. I was just going to say as well, because I think, the content's really important, having the visuals, a really great aid. But if it's easier for you to kind of get through the content by taking down the slides and just kind of speaking to camera, kind of with full visibility of your notes at your end, very happy for you to do that. We can share the slide deck afterwards, whatever works best for you
that's
to
that's a
impart
good
the
option.
info.
Thanks, Deb.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. First, I'd like to acknowledge also that I'm here on unceded Wurundjeri country and pay my respects to elders past and present. And just to begin with some housekeeping and the usual legal disclaimer that these slides are for general information purposes only, not a substitute for legal advice. For anyone unfamiliar with Tenants Victoria, we're a specialist community legal centre that focuses on renting law. We're also the peak body for the state's almost 2 million renters, which is about 30% of the population. You'll see there's a quick list there of what we do, and I'll provide some specific information on the support we provide community workers later on in the presentation. Okay, so just a quick overview of what I'll cover. First, I'll provide a high-level overview of the key renting rights that are relevant to climate adaptation, the ones I'll cover, and these aren't the only ones, but they're the main ones, are first, the minimum standards, the renter provider's duty to provide a rental premises that's in a reasonably fit and suitable condition for occupation, disclosure obligations, and modification rights. After that, I'll cover some gaps, barriers, and compliance challenges of the new energy efficiency standards. Then I'll quickly explain some remedies if rental providers don't comply with the laws and the dispute resolution pathways available. Okay, jumping in to the minimum standards. And some starting with some quick history and background on why they're important. In Victoria, so I've just realized I didn't start my stopwatch, so I'll just assume I'll better get going. Okay, in Victoria, a large proportion of our existing rental properties are poorer quality because they were built before higher building construction standards were introduced in the late 90s. Many of these older rental properties are very drafty and they don't have insulation, or at least enough, and they're fitted out with very inefficient appliances that are very costly to run. Minimum standards help to fix this. They set a baseline quality standard that rental providers have to meet before they can lawfully rent their property. Victoria's first minimum standards came into effect in March 2021. Some of them deal with health and safety issues that are climate adaptation related, such as ventilation, structural soundness, electrical safety, dampness, and mold. Over the last 5 years, there's been a number of amendments to the law that have gradually lifted the standards. But this year saw a major breakthrough with the passing of the new energy efficiency minimum standards, which is a very significant and welcome reform, which is expected to make an enormous difference for the health and welfare of renters and also to improve their finances. The new energy efficiency standards commenced on 1 July this year and are gradually phased in over a number of years, starting from March 2027. One thing which is probably a key takeaway is that there are now 3 different sets of minimum standards, and that the energy efficiency and thermal comfort requirements for each set differs. The highest standards apply to private rental housing because they're the homes that will need to include the latest energy efficiency requirements. Then there's a separate set for community housing, which is a lower bar in terms of thermal and energy efficiency features. And finally, there's a separate set of minimum standards for rooming houses, which is the lowest quality bar. The discrepancy between standards obviously has serious social equity implications because the people who live in community housing and rooming houses are often more financially disadvantaged, and they can also have complex needs that make them more vulnerable to extreme heat. So we're hoping to see further reforms for these properties and the quality gap disappear as soon as possible. Okay, hopefully you can see this table. Which sets out the 6 new energy efficiency requirements that rental providers must meet and the compliance timing. I'll just explain how the timing works because it's a bit tricky. Excuse me. For each requirement, you'll see there's 2 things listed in the right-hand column: a from date and then an event that occurs later on, which is either the start of a new lease or the end of the life of an appliance. The need to comply is triggered when the from date arrives and the subsequent event occurs. So, for example, for ceiling insulation, the landlord can wait around until March 2027, but from then on, they'll need to get it installed when a new lease starts. So basically, you gotta wait around for both things to happen. Also, just a general disclaimer with this table, which I've been asked to provide, the compliance timing is what we understand the law to be at this point, but it's not 100% clear how some of these provisions apply retrospectively. So, for example, it's uncertain how leases in place before the minimum standards commenced back in March 2021 are affected. We're hoping that CAV will release some further guidance soon. Okay, just to quickly go through each of the requirements. Ceiling insulation, the requirement is for the landlord to place insulation where none exists. And of course, only in the ceiling, not in the walls. It has to be a minimum 5 R5 batt rating, which is a nice thick layer. If there is existing installation anywhere that's of a lower R rating, the landlord doesn't have to top it up, and compliance is required from the 1st of March 2027 at the start of a new lease. Next one, draft proofing. There needs to be weather seals installed on all external doors, windows, and wall vents from the 1st of July 2027 at the start of a new lease. There's also a requirement if a house still has gas appliances for a pre-draft proofing safety check to make sure there's adequate ventilation. Next one, energy efficient hot water systems. Existing hot water heaters are to be replaced with an efficient hot water heat pump or a solar water heater from the 1st of March 2027 when the old system dies. Next, energy efficient heating. Gas heaters replaced with more efficient reverse cycle air conditioners, which has to be done by the 1st of March 2027 at the end of life of the existing system. Next, energy efficient cooling. This is a great reform. This requires the main living area to be cooled by an efficient fixed cooling system, which will typically be the same reverse cycle air conditioner that serves as the heater in winter. This needs to be done from the 1st of March 2027 at the start of a new lease. If there's no existing system or at the end of the existing, at the end of life of the existing system. The compliance requirement for cooling is a bit different because there's also a drop-dead compliance date at the 1st of July 2030. And finally, the last one is to replace low-flow shower heads with a minimum 4-star WELS rating from the 1st of March 2027 at the start of a new lease. That will, of course, save water and also mean that hot waters don't have to work as hard. Okay. As I said before, the new energy efficiency minimum standards are really welcome reform and a great step forward, but they also present some challenges, and here's a few of them. The first one is that these standards are dense and complex and contain highly technical terminology. Given what they cover, this is hard to avoid, but it makes understanding and applying them difficult. Many standards require knowledge in areas beyond the layperson. For example, there are references to the plumbing code, small-scale technology certificates, and guidelines for on-site wastewater effluent dispersal and recycling systems. Some important terms will require clarification. For example, when exactly is an existing appliance at the end of its life? The complexity makes the standards hard to understand, not only for renters, but also for rental providers and property agents. Next, the wide availability of exemptions. Many standards have a large number of exemptions. Some of them are quite broad and uncertain. For example, some standards don't have to be complied with if doing so would be abnormally costly or unreasonable. This leaves wiggle room for misinterpretation, either innocently or deliberately. And in a moment, in the next slide, I'll show you a list of exemptions available for energy efficient hot water systems, just to give you a better sense of how many and how complex they are. Next is challenges determining appliance adequacy. It can be complex and difficult for renters to identify the correct appliance for the room because the effectiveness of split system air conditioners can depend on differences in room sizes and floor layouts and whether rooms can be sealed off. Next, complex transition and retrospectivity issues. I mentioned this before with my disclaimer, but as the law changes, it gets difficult to understand how the new standards apply to older lease agreements, and working out how the RTA transition provisions apply to these new standards at this point is very complex. And finally, non-compliance will likely remain an issue. In Victoria, the effectiveness of renting depends largely on renters' willingness to self-advocate to protect their rights. The complexity of the standards and the many exemptions means that renters may struggle to spot non-compliance. Also, the power imbalance in the current tight rental market isn't going away soon, and many renters may be reluctant to enforce the rights for fear of retaliation. So it's arguably even more important than usual for CAV to take a more proactive compliance and enforcement role. Okay, so there's a sample of the challenges. Those aren't the only ones, but again, they're very important and significant reforms, and be some teething and complexity problems for everyone to get their heads around. But once they're bedded down, these new energy efficiency standards will make a real difference. And here's that slide real quick to give you an idea of the exemptions that are available for the hot water standard. Yeah, I won't go through them, but yeah, see there's a few there that are fairly vague and hard to figure out if they apply. Okay, where am I here now? So finished off the minimum standards. That's information on minimum standards, and I'll quickly now just cover the three main renting rights relevant, other renting rights relevant to adaptation. They're not the only ones, but they're the main ones. Okay, so first is the fundamental duty for the rental provider to provide a rental premises in good repair and in reasonably fit and suitable condition for occupation. This is a strict duty that applies regardless of the age and character of the premises, the amount of rent paid, and whether the renter knew of the faults when they moved in. The renter can argue if their rental home has, such poor thermal performance and gets so hot and uncomfortable that it becomes unbearable and unreasonable to expect them to stay there, that the premises can't be said to be in a reasonably fit and suitable condition for occupation, and the rental provider should make thermal improvements. This general duty is possibly less important now that we have minimum standards in place, but may come in handy as a fallback if they are found not to apply, or potentially in circumstances where the rental provider relies on exemptions to avoid carrying out necessary improvements. And we'll have to watch this space. All right. Next is, yep, I think that's the right one. Disclosure obligations. This is about the extent that the rental provider is required to let the renter know about the risk, the energy and thermal efficiency of the home, and also about its disaster risk upfront before the lease is entered. Upfront disclosure about thermal and energy efficiency is important because the more a renter knows, the better off they are to assess whether they can afford to live there. It's particularly important for renters of lesser means who are disproportionately impacted by higher energy bills. The law requires that the rental provider must disclose whether the property meets the minimum standards, including the energy efficiency minimum standards, at the point of leasing, and soon also at the point of advertising too. It's an offence for the rental provider to fail to disclose whether the property meets minimum standards, and the renter can report the rental provider to Consumer Affairs Victoria using the general complaints form on the CAV website. And CAV then has the power to issue an infringement notice. Also, from 25 November, there will be a new disclosure requirement for the rental provider to keep records to prove they are complying with the minimum standards and produce them on request to the CAV director, which will be important for CAV's compliance monitoring purposes. Okay, here's the disaster obligations in relation to disaster risk, which is currently that there are none. As under the law as it stands, rental providers are under no obligation to disclose information about a rental property's flood or bushfire risk level at the point of lease. We're expecting this to change soon for flooding. As part of the government's response to recommendations made by the parliamentary inquiry into the 2022 floods, the government committed to introducing mandatory disclosure of flood risk and history as part of the rental application process. This was meant to happen in 2025, but isn't included in the November reforms, so fingers crossed for next year. Renters can also research a prospective property's flood and bushfire risks themselves through the ways I've listed there at the bottom of the slide. Next is modification rights. So this is about the renter's right to make modifications to the property themselves in order to increase thermal and energy performance. The first point is that a renter can make some minor energy efficient modifications without needing the rental provider's consent, like adding non-permanent window film to increase insulation or LED light globes, provided they're not changing the fittings. But if they want to make more significant modifications that are not covered by the minimum standards, things like ceiling fans, double glazing, external window shading devices, or solar panels and battery storage, they'll first need to obtain the rental provider's written permission. The good news, however, is that the rental provider can't unreasonably refuse to consent. Regarding the upfront purchase and installation costs, excuse me, renters can try asking the rental provider to pay for or at least contribute to the costs. Or they aren't obliged to, and if they refuse, the renter will need to pay the costs themselves. Landlords frequently refuse because they don't share in the benefits of lower utility bills, but they may be more willing to contribute if the improvements will remain in place after the lease ends and the features give the landlord opportunity to charge higher rent. Government programs that subsidize the cost of making energy improvements like Victorian energy upgrades for rentals and the Solar Homes program can sweeten the investment business case for landlords and help to get them on board. Excuse me. The parties should also agree in writing on what's to happen at the end of the lease, including whether the renter is required to remove the features and restore the premises. Unless there's an agreement in place otherwise, when the renter moves out, they will be responsible for restoring the rental property to the condition it was in before the modification was made. Okay, now for information on remedies and dispute resolution pathways.
Tim, sorry, just
Yeah.
as you're getting into this, just to kind of give you some just a heads up around time. We're at 12:04 and we're due to finish around 12:15.
Okay. All right. Well, let me just race through this, and then I'll be able to catch up on some time. Sorry, Deb.
Thank you. I appreciate your expertise.
Okay, non-compliance remedies. The first point is that all duties I've mentioned are what's called duty provisions, which means that if they contravene, then all the important compensation and compliance provisions of the RTA apply. The renter can send a breach of duty notice, and if the rental provider ignores it, that triggers a range of possible remedies, including the right to apply for compensation, seek compliance orders, and in some circumstances, even terminate the lease. Regarding compensation claims, to be successful, renters would need to show not only that the rental provider was at fault and in breach of the relevant duty, but also that the renter had suffered a loss as a result of that breach. This can include both loss of enjoyment of the property and economic loss. So, for example, if the rental provider failed to comply with the energy efficiency minimum standards by, say, refusing to install energy efficient appliances, the renter might attempt to claim compensation for the additional utility costs they had to pay. Look, I'll skip this one to save time. It was basically there's this thing called the rent special account where you can go along to VCAT. Sorry, the renter can go along to VCAT and apply for an order to pay their rent to the rent special account. What that means, sorry, that's an account administered by Consumer Affairs Victoria, and what it means is, they can pay their rent to CAV, still comply with their obligations to pay the rent, but guess what? The rental provider doesn't get that, so it can be used as an incentive, sort of like a tactical measure to encourage the rental provider to comply with their duties, and it applies in circumstances where there are repairs to be done, and that includes when minimum standards aren't met, because it's a bit weird. The terminology of the Act considers that if you fail to comply with minimum standards, it's a repair. Doesn't really make a lot of sense, in the context of energy efficiency appliances. But yeah, okay. Dispute pathways. The thing to be aware of here is that there's a new renting dispute settlement process called Rental Dispute Resolution Victoria, or RDRV, that started in July. Renters with disputes over repairs, rent increases, compensation claims, and bonds need to first apply to RV before they can go to VCAT. Disputes over non-compliance with energy efficiency minimum standards are considered repairs issues under the Act. So renters with these need to go to RDRV first. It's a quick and informal process. You have a mediator called a resolution coordinator who sort of does a to and fro, back and forth with the parties, tries to come to an agreement they're both happy with. Yeah, the thing to remember here is the resolution coordinator is impartial, and they don't actually provide legal advice. So renters need to be aware of their rights going into the process, and have a bit of an idea about what sort of outcome they're going to be happy with. And they don't actually have to, of course, agree to the settlement, and yeah, can ask for the process to cease and go to VCAT at any time. Okay, I think probably everybody's familiar with VCAT. It's also an informal process, often done online or sorry, by telephone, and both parties get the opportunity to provide their say, and the member hears the evidence and yeah, makes a binding decision. Okay, finally, one last important thing to keep to remember here is that sorry, this is about finding help, where you can go to find help if you want to help renters. There's been some research done by the Victoria Law Foundation that shows that the level of legal literacy in the community is actually fairly low, and that many people in the community struggle to recognise when they have a legal problem. This is a big issue because if they can't spot when their problem is a legal problem, they won't think to seek legal help. Community workers and health workers can play a valuable role helping the renter clients to identify legal problems, and then letting them know where to go to get free legal advice, or even providing them with a warm referral. This slide provides the information, the sort of help that Tenants Victoria provides. And the thing to be very aware of is that we can help community workers that are supporting renters with a 30-minute online help session, and you can book those through our website. They're called the Community Worker Tenancy Service. Yeah, I'll leave that. Yeah, finally, there's a bunch of other support programs, not a bunch, some. The Tenancy Assistance and Advocacy Program, that's a geographically based renter support program, and you can find your local provider by going to the CAB website. There's a list there. Tenancy Plus, sorry, TAP, the TAP program is for private rentals. Tenancy Plus program is public housing tenants, includes community housing. But if you've got a client who's in community or public housing, then yeah, same thing, Tenancy Plus program, except you can find the providers on the Housing Vic website. And there's always community legal centres who can help, although not all of them provide renting support. And Victoria Legal Aid offers a helpline too, and they've also got a chat facility these days. That's me. Sorry about that.
Thank you so much, Tim. It's Deb speaking. And Kelly and Julianne, if you want to put your cameras on as well, that's great. Now, we are due to formally kind of wrap up in a couple of minutes' time. And I know that people who are online have put this event into their diary and may have to kind of rush off to other things. What I might do though is I might still just ask a few of the questions because we will, even if people need to drop off the this webinar, it will be recorded. We'll be able to kind of send a copy of the responses afterwards. So Tim, Kelly and Julianne, if you're happy to hang on a little bit longer, that would be really great. One of the first questions, and this might be one for you, Julianne, is where can renters find disaster risk mapping to understand the impact on potential rental locations? What's your advice there, please?
Thanks, Deb. Kelly and Tim may have something to add to this, but actually disaster risk mapping is a pretty huge gap in Victoria, Australia, actually probably around the world. This is something that we kind of looked into as far as where can people find that information if they're looking to rent and if they're in other situations as well. And it really is just a huge gap. As Tim said, there's no requirement for rental providers to provide disaster risk information. I think if a property has been impacted by a disaster previously, you can find that information out, but it's something I think you have to ask for. But as far as being able to look at a map and find out where are the areas that I should be avoiding, that's just not something that's easily available. Things that I can point you towards are the Victorian Climate Science Report and the Future Climate Tool, which I believe have been shared in the chat, but if not, we can send those out afterwards. The problem with those is that those resources is that they show future climate projections under different scenarios. And so that can give you an idea of roughly the areas where there might be flooding in the future, there might be bushfire in the future, there might be storms and increased heat in the future. But the difficulty with all of this in the context of a changing climate is that we don't know exactly what those conditions will look like in the coming 5, 10, 20, 50 years. We have projections depending on the pathway society follows and how much action we take to reduce emissions and act on climate change now and in the coming years. But it really depends on what pathway we follow as far as where those disasters will be seen and how intense they will be and how frequent they will be. And it's just really difficult to model that. Climate science just really isn't at the point of being able to do that now. And much less is it able to pinpoint exact properties and be able to say, if you want to look at this house, if you want to rent at this particular location, this is what's likely to be seen. What we do have that Tim has spoken about as well is flood risk mapping, which does start to account for those future climate projections, but for the most part, it's based on historic data. But you can look at, there's some different areas you can look at. Digital Twin Victoria shows you the highest flood impact that we're likely to see across the state. You can call up your local council. If you're in Greater Melbourne, you can look at Melbourne Water's website. You actually have to pay for a property report at this stage. This is one of the issues that we're looking at actually in a piece that we're doing around flood resilience and housing. And it's one of the issues that this information is very much fragmented and it's just really difficult to access. So I appreciate that it is a challenge.
And Julianne, I was just going to say as well, in terms of kind of current state and kind of the information that is kind of available, like right now, one of the things that you kind of mentioned is that, you know, it would require a renter or a prospective renter to actually ask the rental provider or the property manager for that information. And thinking, Kelly, about some of your scene setting around the power imbalances in the market as well. I think I'm kind of curious to just like unpeel the layers a little bit in terms of those power imbalances and kind of what remedies or pathways are available to renters. So Kelly, this might be one for you and for Tim, but Kelly, you were talking about the short-term kind of issues after a climate disaster. So, you know, the rental pool reduces, rent spike. And I'm thinking that kind of in this environment, in that kind of those market conditions that, you know, we start to see behaviours such as property managers or rental providers soliciting rental bidding, even though that's against the law. We start to see things perhaps like a range, like a price range or a rent range put out there rather than a specified kind of precise price. So people really flouting, you know, the kind of the laws and regulatory environment. I'm just thinking of these, you know, what should a renter do in those types of situations? Like what remedies available? Tim, you talked about some of the funded supports and kind of institutional kind of actors and pathways. Are these the kinds of matters that are in scope for the new dispute resolution body that you mentioned? What other advice would you have, Kellie and Tim, around people being able to know and not only know but assert their rights in that kind of situation? Kellie, did you want to kind of kick off with some comments first, and then Tim, I'm also kind of curious to keen to kind of clarify for our listeners, what is in scope for RDRB, for example. Thanks, Kellie.
So really interesting. In spite of all the laws and regulations, I'll give you an example. After the October 2022 floods in one Victorian town, there were about 7 rentals that remained, and we saw within a matter of weeks all of those renters receive eviction notices, and they all left because they all thought they had to get out. So that's a real barrier. There's often some issues with literacy or lack of understanding of the system, and sometimes English as a second language. So they were all evicted. They didn't seek advice, and they left the area, which was quite sad. Some of them were on working visas, and they went home. We know this from general conversation in the community. They did not formally engage with the service. Those properties were then advertised for triple what they were previously rented for. So there was a clear case of landlords taking advantage of the situation, and affordable housing in that area was, almost non-existent. But what was left became incredibly high. Surrounding areas up to a 45-minute drive, surrounding towns also saw a massive spike in rental. That is because everybody's homes who have been destroyed under their insurance policies were provided temporary comms. So that's all taken up very quickly by others, particularly homeowners who have that. A big issue is that renters are not aware of that temporary accommodation protection under a contents policy, and you can take out a minimal contents policy that gives you that protection. Should put a waiver in there that not all contents policies have that additional cover, so renters should definitely check. And I think my advice is when we see renters in a situation such as that, get legal advice. So your community legal centre or the list that Tim put on screen, they should seek advice immediately. Call Tenants Vic. Getting the messaging out to community is the barrier there, and we all need to be able to do that. So Tim, I'll pass to you to answer the second part of that question.
Look, the disaster scenario is a very complex one for renters, and the RTA, it was drafted 25 years ago, and it wasn't really drafted with disasters in mind. There is some protections there, but it's a very complex situation, and when the rental property has been significantly damaged, there's almost like the provisions drive a rush to termination on both sides. The renters want to terminate so that excuse me, their rental obligation finishes, and the rental provider wants to terminate because they've got an obligation to provide a fit and suitable rental property, and they're not in a position where they can do that. So it's this, no man's land, and the effect is, as I said, a rush to termination, and this is particularly a problem because in a rental housing crisis, and also in small regional towns, it's often the case that whatever vacant rental properties there are, they quickly get exhausted, and then renters have to go to the next town and the next town and the next town, and what happens is they basically lose touch with their community, lose touch with their support networks, and the really vulnerable renters are kind of at the back of the line in terms of in the application line and because there's a lot of
Tim,
competition for
Tim, can I
property.
just jump in as well with that? I think, you know, the example that Kellie gave was very compelling in terms of then also then that overlay of like exploitative behaviours and illegal behaviours that happen where it's not necessarily that people are being kind of issues with notices to vacate because the property is damaged and cannot easily be kind of remedied and is not safe to kind of and non-compliant with minimum standards because of kind of the damage, but actually it's about almost like gaming the system or gaming the market to say, actually, these properties are unaffected, but because the pool has, the supply pool has like reduced, we can make triple the money that we were before. And so we're going to use this as kind of this event as cover to basically profit from people's misery and disaster and misfortune. And so I'm just thinking about then, you know, the kind of examples that that, you know, Kellie gave and I gave in terms of then, you know, notices to vacate, you know, so evictions around like things like, you know, rental bidding, things like, you know, advertising like a range rather than a price. Are they the types of matters that are in scope for RDRV, or are they VCAT matters? Where's the kind of entry point or starting
Yes,
point?
and sorry if I misunderstood
No, that's
the
okay.
question. Rent rises are one of the issues that are on the list with Rental Dispute Resolution Victoria. So you've got you've got to go to RDRV first, and you know, as to exploitative behaviour, if rental providers are wanting to get rid of the tenant in order to release it at a higher price, they're going to have a hard time, probably, I would think, getting over the reasonable and proportionate test. At VCAT, they have to convince the member that eviction is reasonable and proportionate. The tenant's going to be in a really tough position, and the VCAT member, I think, will likely recognise that and be quite reluctant to be providing an eviction notice to a tenant in that situation.
Great, Tim. So if we understand correctly from the audience perspective, so something like, you know, rent increases, that's the new pathway there that's available to people as an option is RDRV, that kind of which styles itself as free, fast, fair dispute resolution. That's the language, the official language that sits around that. That's not necessarily my language. That's the language used to describe it. Certainly that's probably the experience that some people are having at the moment. And then those matters where around like notice to vacate, like evictions matters, that is a matter that goes straight to kind of like VCAT. Is that correct?
Look, there was actually some talk that RDRV would be taking on eviction matters. My understanding is at this point that hasn't occurred yet. That's not on the list. If a rental provider to evict a renter, the rental provider has to get an order, a possession order, an eviction order, and a warrant of possession, which means that it has to go to VCAT. So always the renter will have an opportunity to have their say at VCAT, and again, the disaster scenario is so fraught for renters that the member will hopefully have an ear out for their problems.
Thank you. Kellie, can I ask you service access? Oh, you've got your hand up to add to that, so I'll get you to add to that. And then I've got a question about access to financial counsellors for people with
no problem.
additional
I saw
needs.
that.
Thank you.
I just wanted to jump back to that question about finding out a property's risk rating. I did put 2 links in the chat, one of which Julianne mentioned, that Melbourne Water are continuing to do mapping and some of it's been published. But I like to reframe this for people. We're all susceptible. We're all in housing that's at risk to a point. You know, we had very high winds 2 weeks ago. That's a climate risk event. And then your map earlier, Julianne, showing, and I took particular note, it showed Melton, Casey, Hume, Whittlesea and Wyndham as areas where they're on the outerlying areas of Melbourne, and there's been significant increase in average temperature over the last couple of years. Those areas are at risk. They don't feel like it because they're now suburbs, but they're at risk of bushfire, particularly because they're often surrounded by low-lying grassland. And we are seeing, there was a bushfire in the western suburbs 2 weeks ago, correct me if I'm wrong there. I think people need just to be aware that we are all at risk. We live in that state, and outlying areas are at risk. So if we can get that message, and often in those outlying areas, there's a lot of multicultural communities. We're doing a lot of work with those at the moment, and they don't understand that risk. Or maybe people that don't have access to technology that they can read about the risks. So if as people working with communities, we can get that message out there, that's vitally important. You don't necessarily need a map or a tool to make people aware that they may be in a high risk area. Just by the state of being in the outer ring, they really are.
Thanks, Kellie. That's just really wise advice. And I think just a reminder that sometimes we can feel a little disempowered in this kind of in this context right now. But often there are like practical things that we can do to understand the changing kind of climate, be asking the right questions. And it also feeds into a bigger picture around the kind of systemic advocacy that we need to be doing as well. And just kind of quickly want to mention as well, in terms of some of those barriers for communities such as people from like culturally and linguistically diverse barriers, what we know through the work of Financial Counselling Vic, of Tenants Vic, of VCOSS and others, is that that, you know, is not about kind of like lack of personal responsibility or personal failings. It's actually about these systemic barriers that actually prevent people from understanding the context in which we are kind of living, working, playing. And so that really important kind of like bridging kind of role that community service organisations, peak bodies, others play in actually that connecting, linking kind of work, so that people kind of can overcome those barriers and understand, as I said, the environments in which we live, work and play. We are really running over now. I'm just going to ask two final questions that I think are kind of quick ones. One of them might be a yes/no kind of answer, Tim. One is about whether RDRV, so the new dispute resolution body, can assist tenants in community housing or public housing. Is RDRV just for private renters and providers in the private rental space, or is community or public housing in scope? Do you know, Tim?
Look, to tell you the truth, Deb, I might have to take that on notice. I believe that it's both, but I'm not 100% sure. So yeah.
We'll follow up. Yeah, best. We
Yep.
want to make sure that we're giving accurate information.
Yeah.
So I've kind of got a gut response to that, but as well, we just want to check that we've got that information rock solid, crystal clear for you. The other one is maybe like a date thing. So you presented a table that showed where different kind of aspects of the new minimum energy efficiency standards kind of kick in. So like when they take effect, and then like a trigger event, like whether it's end of life of an appliance or you know, the signing of an execution of a new lease. But the question is around the disclosure obligations. So when do the thermal and energy efficiency disclosure obligations kick in? Does that kind of relate to you know, that the kind of the point of time in terms of like the signing of a new lease, the
Yeah,
end of life,
that's
so
right.
people aren't having to gather their evidence now. It's at the point at that particular point for that property.
Look, the disclosure requirement is basically a disclosure requirement to comply to advise a renter whether the minimum standards have been met, and that's currently at the point of the enter occupy going into the property, getting the keys and moving in. There's a recent reform. There's a reform, that's going to be passed in November, in a few weeks, at the end of November, where they're going to extend that out to also they're going to require at the point of advertising too. So that'll be more of an obligation probably on estate agents and property managers when they're advertising a place, but also on rental private providers too. So good to see that extended to advertising too. So, but it's really before a new lease starts, that they have to be disclosing whether the minimum standards applies. It's not perfect. If we had more in-depth, nuanced information, because as I mentioned before, the minimum standard, energy efficiency minimum standards, are going to have all sorts of exemptions. And it may be that the rental providers will be able to say, hey, they've all been met, but on condition. So that's going to be a problem, and hopefully the new reporting, the new form that CAV is designing is going to bring that out and help us see what's really going on.
Right. We are going to wrap up now. Kellie, I just think that, sorry, I feel like my head's a bit of a sieve managing the time and my looking at the clock. I don't know whether I actually followed up with that question. Sorry if I asked you. In terms of access needs of, say, a renter
Yes.
with intellectual disabilities, is financial counselling, Vic, as in terms of your services, but also kind of your members, able to be responsive and meet the access needs of someone with an intellectual disability if they're needing financial counselling and they want that kind of support to receive that independently, not having to have a support worker with them? Is there kind of that capacity and capability in financial counselling?
They will. The FCVIC don't provide financial counselling. We're the peak body. We can connect you with your local organisation. I've also just answered that question in the chat with a link to the Find a Financial Counsellor tool.
Great.
I will just note, though, that somebody does need to have capacity to make their own decisions. So if there's not legal capacity, they will require someone there who has that capacity to decide on their behalf. But if they have capacity, financial counselling is accessible and they should make their needs known to the local agency. But you can certainly call FCVIC and we'll talk to you further about that matter. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now we are very over time, and I'm someone that notoriously runs late, but this is very late now. So thanks for those who stuck with us. Thanks for our expert speakers and panelists. If you're interested to kind of keep engaging in this conversation about renting and climate adaptation, Julianne mentioned the work that she's been doing around Adaptation for All report and project. Julianne's also mentioned different networks that you can be involved with at VCOSS. Our other panelists have also shared resources, and we'll kind of package those up post-event and send those to you. Thanks again to Julianne, to Kellie from Financial Counselling Victoria, to Tim from Tenants Victoria. Also just want to give a shout out thanks to the Department of Government Services, Consumer Affairs Victoria and the Victorian Property Fund. These Renters' Rights Rundown events are made possible with their support, so thank you so much. And we will continue to not only do this kind of information provision, sector capacity and capability building, but really kind of putting our shoulders to the wheel around systemic advocacy as well. So thanks to everyone for all this collaborative collegiate work together to ensure that we're riding hard on renters' rights here in Victoria. Thanks to the VCOSS team. Really particularly want to shout out Ella and Amy for their support behind the scenes. Thanks for joining us, everyone, and I'll see you again next time. Thank you.